March 1945. Camp Kearney, Nebraska. The scrape of the shovel on the rough barrack floorboards was like metal on bone. Hana Tanaka stood rigid, her hands pressed so tightly together her knuckles were white. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, boiled potatoes, and the sour scent of the unseasoned pine walls. Sergeant Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently frozen by the Nebraska wind, kicked at the small bundle of rags beneath her cot. "What's this? Hoarding?" He yanked the rags away. The object they revealed was stark, almost profane in the dim light. A bright blue rectangular Spam tin. It was filled with dark, damp soil, and from its center, vibrant and impossibly green, grew a single, perfect sprout with two delicate leaves. Miller stared, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He poked the soil with a thick finger. "What is this? Contraband?" Hana's breath caught. The mess hall whistle shrieked in the distance, signaling the midday meal, but she could not move. Her voice was a dry whisper, tight with a fear that was greater than any she had felt for her own safety. "It is daikon." We explore stories of transformation from all sides of history. If you value this perspective, consider subscribing and letting us know what country you're watching from. 4 weeks earlier, Camp Kearney, Nebraska. The whistle split the frozen air. It was a sound that did not belong in the vast, flat emptiness of Nebraska. It was a shriek of metal, thin and cold, and it meant Sunday. Hana Tanaka pulled her thin wool blanket tighter. In her mind, Sunday was the smell of miso soup simmering, the quiet scrape of her father's brush on rice paper. Here, Sunday was a sound that sliced through the barracks, commanding motion. She pushed her feet into wooden gaita, the straps stiff with cold, and joined the silent line of women shuffling toward the mess hall. The mud, frozen solid at dawn, had thawed just enough to become a greedy, sucking clay that pulled at their feet. The hall was a long, low building that smelled of boiled potatoes, stale coffee, and something metallic. The line moved slowly, trays scraping. Hana kept her eyes down, focusing on the scuffed floorboards, a teacher practicing a discipline of self-erasure. Then she was at the front. A large red-faced man in a white apron, another internee, his face sullen, worked the line. He gestured with his ladle. "Tray." Hana held it out. He slopped on a gray scoop of watery eggs and a hard, dark piece of rye toast. And then, the Sunday specialty. He reached into a deep metal pan and pulled out a perfect, gelatinous rectangle. It was a pale, unnerving pink, glistening with a clear jelly. He dropped it onto her tray with a wet thud. The smell hit her instantly. Canned salt, boiled fat, and the tin it came from. It was Spam. Hana's stomach clenched. A memory, sharp and violent, surfaced. Her mother, in their small kitchen in Shizuoka, deftly slicing a crisp, white daikon, the clean, earthy scent filling the air. This was not food. This was an industrial product, a symbol of everything she had lost. It was the food of a people who did not understand substance, only preservation. The line behind her pressed forward. "Move it," the server grunted. Hana looked at the pink slab, her breath catching. She felt a wave of nausea so profound it made her dizzy. She was not just a prisoner. She was livestock, being fed processed rations from a can. She could not eat it. She would not. "Take the tin," the man said, shoving a bright blue, empty can toward her. Inspection. They were required to take the empty tins back to the barracks to prove they were not hoarding or building things. Her hand, trembling slightly, closed around the cold metal. It was light, but it felt impossibly heavy. She walked away from the counter, carrying the object of her humiliation, the whistle fading behind her, replaced by the ringing in her ears. Hana sat on her cot, the metal frame cold through the thin mattress. She placed the blue Spam tin on the floor beside her. It stared up at her. A bright, vulgar blue, its purpose fulfilled and now empty. She hated it. She hated the waste it represented, and the meal she had left untouched on her tray. Outside, the Nebraska wind howled. It was a sound without end, a constant physical pressure against the thin pine walls of the barrack, scouring the land of feature and memory. It was, she thought, a wind that erased things. She feared she was being erased too. Her life as a teacher in Shizuoka, the smell of chalk dust, the sound of 30 small voices reciting poetry, the precise way she folded her kimono. It all felt thin, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. Her sanity depended on these small, sharp details. If she lost them, she would become as gray and empty as the landscape. To anchor herself, she reached for her sewing kit, a small cloth bundle. It held 2 needles, a spool of dark thread, and her last koshihimo, the simple waist tie for her kimono. Its cotton fabric, once a deep indigo, was faded. The seam along the edge frayed. She threaded the needle, her fingers stiff. The barrack was quiet, filled only with the sound of the wind and the muted rustling of other women. She began to work, her stitches small and practiced. It was a familiar rhythm, a micro-action that held the chaos at bay. Her finger, tucked inside the fabric to guide the needle, brushed against something. It was a lump, a small, hard object lodged deep in the seam where the fabric was folded and sewn. It was not thread. Her breath stopped. With delicate, almost surgical precision, she used the needle's tip to pick at the old stitches, unraveling the thread she herself had likely sewn years ago. She pulled the seam open. There, nestled in a tiny pocket of lint, was a single dried seed. It was teardrop-shaped, a dull brownish gray. She knew it instantly. Daikon. Hana lifted it onto her palm. It was so small, a dormant speck of life that had traveled thousands of miles, hidden in the fold of her clothing, surviving the inspections, the long train ride, the humiliation. It was a stowaway, a tiny defiant piece of home, a sharp, painful jolt of memory, clearer than any she had felt in months, struck her. Her mother's garden, the dark, rich soil, the sharp, peppery smell of the radish greens. The apathy that had settled on her like frost began to crack. This was not just a seed. It was evidence. It was proof. It was alive, and a living thing needed soil. Her eyes moved from the seed in her hand and fell upon the bright, empty, waiting blue of the Spam tin on the floor. The Spam tin was not just empty. It was unclean. A thin, translucent film of gelatinous fat coated the inside, smelling faintly of salt and boiled meat. It was the residue of the very thing that had repulsed her. To place a seed from her home into this vessel, as it was, felt like a violation. She took the tin to the washroom at the end of the barrack. It was a cold, damp space that smelled of lye and mildew. There was only one tap, and it ran only with icy, metallic water. Hana turned the tap. The water hit the tin with a sharp ping. She splashed it, but the greasy film merely repelled the cold water, shining with an oily indifference. She needed friction. She needed heat. She had neither. She used the edge of her koshihimo, the very cloth that had carried the seed, rubbing at the slick sides. The cotton snagged on the tin's rough, rolled rim, the fat just smeared, turning a milky white. Mrs. Ito, an older woman from Nagasaki, watched her from the next basin. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "It's just a tin, Hana-san. Trash is trash." Hana ignored her, her jaw tightening. This was the barrier. The casual despair of the others, the lack of basic tools, the persistent, cold grease. It felt like the camp itself, trying to contaminate the one clean thing she possessed. If she failed at this, This simple act of cleaning, the seed would remain a dormant, useless speck. Her agency would be just as useless. She scrubbed until her fingers were raw, the cold penetrating the joints of her knuckles, turning them a dull, aching red. The metal scraped against the porcelain basin. It was futile. She stopped, breathing hard, looking at her numb fingers. Then she made a choice. From her pocket, she retrieved her most hoarded possession, a sliver of harsh, yellow lye soap no bigger than her thumb. It was meant for her face, her hands, the last vestige of personal hygiene, of feeling human. She hesitated for only a second. This new purpose was more important than her comfort. Hannah pressed the soap sliver into the tin and began to scrub, this time with a desperate, focused energy. The lye bit into the fat. A weak, gray lather began to form. The smell of lye and cold, congealed meat filled her nose, a nauseating combination. She scrubbed harder, her knuckles scraping the metal, ignoring the sting. She was not just cleaning a tin. She was performing a ritual. She was scouring away the insult, purifying the vessel, making it worthy. With each circle of her hand, she was pouring her own sacrifice into the metal, choosing this secret project over her own dignity. Finally, she rinsed it one last time. The water ran clean. The inside of the tin was dull aluminum, bare and raw. It was clean. She dried it carefully, hiding it under her blanket. As she sat on her cot, the feeling in her fingers slowly returned, a painful tingling. The tin was ready, but it was just a clean, empty piece of metal. Now it needed the one thing she could not get from a tap. It needed earth. Earth. It seemed like a simple request, but the camp was a sea of frozen mud. The ground, exposed to the relentless wind, was as hard and unforgiving as iron. She watched from the window as women walked to the latrines, their steps leaving no impression on the rigid, frosted dirt. She could not use a shovel. She could not be seen digging. Any deviation from the routine was grounds for suspicion, for questions she could not answer. Failure now, before the seed even touched soil, would be a final, crushing admission that her hope was baseless. The seed would die in her pocket, and she would have to accept the grayness. For 2 days, she studied her surroundings with a new, feral intensity. She was no longer a teacher. She was a creature looking for a chance. She observed the patrol routes. She noted the way the snow melted faster near the south-facing walls, and then she saw it. The barracks were cheap, hasty constructions, elevated a foot or two off the ground on cinder blocks to avoid the seasonal floods. The gap was dark, shadowed, and filled with cobwebs. While the open ground was frozen, the earth under the building, warmed by the residual heat of 60 bodies sleeping on the floorboards above, might be different. She waited until the camp was deep in the enforced silence of night. The final whistle had sounded. The only sound was the wind and the rhythmic breathing of the women around her. She slipped out of her cot, the Spam tin clutched in one hand. She moved to the end of the barrack, near the washroom, where the shadows were deepest. She knelt, the rough floorboards biting into her knees. She lowered herself flat onto her stomach, the cold seeping instantly through her thin nightgown. She pushed the tin in front of her and began to crawl into the darkness under the barrack. The air was close, smelling of damp, musty earth, spiders, and something sour. It was a space for rats, not people. She, Hana Tanaka, who had taught calligraphy and the subtle beauty of haiku, was crawling on her belly in the filth. Her dignity dissolved. It was not a painful loss. It was a necessary shedding, like a skin. All that mattered was the mission. Her hands found the dirt. It was not frozen. It was a thick, cold, damp mud. She began to dig with her bare fingers, clawing at the earth. It was slow, agonizing work. She scooped the icy mud, handful by painful handful, and packed it into the blue tin. Her hands became numb, caked in black. She filled it to the brim. She pushed the tin out first, then wriggled backward, her body shaking from the cold and the exertion. Back on her feet, she hid the tin under her cot, wrapping it in her spare rags. She spent 10 minutes in the freezing washroom, scrubbing the black mud from under her nails, her hands aching so badly she wanted to cry. She returned to her bunk, shivering but victorious. She had debased herself to protect a life. She had the earth. She unwrapped the tin. In the dark, she pushed her finger into the center of the cold mud and dropped the tiny daikon seed into the hole. She covered it, her touch impossibly gentle. The waiting had begun. The waiting was a new kind of torture. It was a thread of suspense pulled taut through the monotonous days. Hannah's routine, once a simple pattern of survival, was now complicated by her secret. Every morning before the whistle, she would reach under the cot. Her fingers would brush the cold tin, then dip into the damp soil. Nothing. The mud remained just mud, cold and inert. Her water ration became precious. She would drink only half of the tin cup given at breakfast, saving the rest. When the barrack was empty, she would drizzle the lukewarm water into the spam tin, an offering, a prayer. She shielded the act with her body, her movements small and furtive. But small, furtive movements were precisely what broke the monotony. And the monotony was all the guards had to watch. His name was Private Evans. He was young, barely 20, with a face that hadn't yet learned to hold the hardness of a soldier. He looked perpetually cold and bored, his shoulders hunched inside a uniform that was slightly too large. He wasn't on the front lines in Europe or the Pacific. He was here in Nebraska, watching women. Hannah began to feel his eyes. She would be walking to the mess hall, and she would see him standing by the fence line, his gaze lingering on her. Not in the predatory way of other men, but with a flat, bovine curiosity. He saw her walking, but he also seemed to notice how she was walking. Her eyes always cast down, her path near the barracks. She saw him watching her as she left the washroom, noting, perhaps, that she always carried her cup. Her paranoia grew. She began to check the tin less, to force herself to walk with her head up, to act normal. But this performance only made her feel more conspicuous. The stakes were absolute. If he reported her, they would search her cot. They would find the tin. They would destroy it as contraband, as filth, and she would be punished. The fragile, nascent hope would be extinguished. One afternoon, during the mandatory outdoor count, he approached. The women stood in loose lines as the guards walked past, checking numbers. The sky was a vast, oppressive white. The crunch of Evans's boots on the frozen gravel was the only sound. He stopped in front of her. Hannah's heart seized. She stared at the third button on his coat. "You okay, ma'am?" The word was so shocking she flinched. Ma'am. It was a word of respect, a word from her old life. It was not internee, not Jap, not you. She looked up, startled. His eyes were blue, clear, and confused. "You're always staring at the floor," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. "Just wondered if you were okay." She could not speak. A monster was predictable. A man who followed rules was predictable. This boy, with his casual ma'am, was not. His soft power, this disarming, simple humanity, was more dangerous than a barked order. It made him unpredictable. It made him a puzzle she could not solve. "I am fine," she whispered. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and moved on. "Count is clear," he shouted to the sergeant. Hannah let out her breath, her legs weak. She was now paranoid, not of a guard, but of a person. and she knew as she walked back to the barrack that the plant, if it lived, would soon need the one thing she absolutely could not hide from him: sunlight. A week passed, then 10 days. The paranoia about Private Evans faded, replaced by a colder, more internal dread. The mud in the Spam tin remained stubbornly dark, stubbornly still. Hannah's morning ritual had become one of grim obligation. She would reach under the cot, her heart a small, hard knot. Her finger would touch the soil, damp and cold. Nothing. Her own doubt, a voice that sounded chillingly like the Nebraska wind, began to speak. The seed was dead. It had been dry for too long. The soil was wrong, scavenged filth from under a building, holding no life. This whole endeavor was a foolish fantasy, a teacher's sentimental gesture. She had sacrificed her soap, debased herself crawling in the mud, and invited suspicion, all for a dead speck. She was trying to grow life in a place defined by its absence. To fail at this would be a final confirmation. It would mean that she, too, was barren, that her identity was as dead as the seed. Her last shred of hope was tied to this tiny, impossible gamble. It was the 11th morning. The air in the barrack was heavy with the smell of sleep and unwashed wool. The whistle had not yet blown. Hannah lay on her side, facing the wall, afraid to perform the check, afraid of the finality of the empty soil. Just look. Know it. Let it go. She forced her arm to move, to reach into the darkness beneath the cot. Her fingers brushed the cold metal rim of the tin. She extended her forefinger to touch the soil, and she felt it. It was not the soft gyve of mud. It was something else. Something with a taut, resilient texture. Her breath hitched. She slid her hand forward, grasping the tin, and pulled it out into the gray pre-dawn light. She stared. Pushing through the black, cracked surface of the mud was a loop, a tiny, perfect pale green loop. It was delicate, almost translucent, yet it possessed a strength that had allowed it to break the soil. It was alive. Hannah put a hand to her mouth. A silent, explosive shock went through her. It was not a memory. It was not a relic. It was a life. It was a future. The crushing weight of her passive despair, the simple, gray endurance, evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by a new, fierce, and terrifying emotion, an active, protective hope. This was no longer about her. It was about it. The daikon sprout, born in a vessel of industrial refuse, had survived. The Spam tin was no longer a symbol of her humiliation. It was a cradle. She looked at the sprout, her eyes tracing its fragile shape. The stakes of her world shifted on their axis. Her own survival had been a passive thing. The survival of this plant was now an active, desperate imperative. She touched one of the cotyledons, the first 2 tiny leaves. They were a pale yellowish green. She knew instantly what was wrong. It was alive, but it was starving. It needed the one thing she had dreaded seeking. It needed light. The plant's need for light was a constant ticking clock. Hannah could see it visibly weakening, its pale stem stretching thin, desperate, etiolated. Her hope, so fiercely ignited, was now shadowed by the logistics of this new, terrible risk. The barracks had only 2 windows, one at each end. They were high, small, and faced the common walkway, visible to everyone. To be seen nurturing a plant, a secret life, was to invite confiscation. The other women would see it as foolishness, attracting unwanted attention. The guards would see it as contraband. She clutched the tin, her mind racing. She had to risk it. She had to risk everything. Her opportunity came at midday. The mess hall whistle shrieked. This time, the sound was not a trigger for a revulsion. It was a starting pistol. Hannah feigned illness, pressing a hand to her stomach as the other women filed out. their gaita scraping the floor. "You go," she whispered to Mrs. Ito. "I cannot eat." The door slammed shut. The barrack was suddenly profoundly silent. She was alone. She listened. The wind, the distant clanging of trays. Nothing else. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Hannah retrieved the SPVAM tin from under her cot. She walked, her steps light, to the far end of the barrack. A single perfect rectangle of bright winter sun fell on the dusty floorboards. It was the first direct sunlight to penetrate the building all day, and it would be gone in less than an hour. She knelt. Her hands were shaking. With a reverence that was almost painful, she placed the blue tin directly in the center of the warm, golden patch. The pale sprout, which had been a ghostly green in the shadows, seemed to respond instantly. The light caught the tiny hairs on its stem, illuminating it. It looked solid, real. Hannah did not retreat. She sat on the floor beside it, a sentinel, her back against the wall, her face turned toward the window. The sun, weak as it was, touched her own skin. It was the first time in months she had felt warmth without the oppressive presence of others. She felt it on her closed eyelids. She and the plant were sharing this stolen moment, this defiant act of photosynthesis. She was not just hiding, she was actively cheating the system, stealing a few minutes of physics, of life, from the regimented grayness. She allowed herself to count to 300. 5 minutes. It was all she dared. She opened her eyes. The plant looked stronger, the green a fraction deeper. Time to go. As her hand reached to retrieve the tin, a shadow fell across the patch of sun. Hannah froze. A figure was passing the window, the measured crunch-crunch of gravel. It was a guard. She recognized the gait. It was Private Evans, walking his patrol earlier than usual. He didn't stop, but his head turned. He glanced through the window, his eyes sweeping the empty room. Hannah was pressed against the wall, just out of his direct line of sight, but the tin was in the open. His gaze passed over it, hesitated for a half second, and then moved on. The crunching faded. Hannah snatched the tin, her breath catching in her throat. She scrambled back to her cot, hiding it in the darkness. He had seen it. He must have. A blue tin, sitting in a patch of sun. He had seen it. The near miss with Private Evans shattered her fragile confidence. He knew. He may not have understood what he saw, a blue tin, a flash of green, but he knew she was hiding something. His curiosity, which had seemed benign, now felt like a spotlight. Hannah retreated into a shell of perfect passivity. She stopped the sunlight rituals. She reverted to her gray persona, keeping her eyes down, her movements predictable. She would not give him a reason to look again. She would sacrifice the plant's health for its secrecy. Let it be pale, she thought, as long as it was alive. Evans, for his part, gave no sign. He walked his patrols. He counted the women. He did not stop her. He did not ask if she was okay. This new silence was, in its way, more terrifying than his curiosity. Did it mean he had forgotten, or that he had reported it and was waiting? Every time she heard the crunch of boots on gravel, her body tensed. Every whistle shriek made her jump. The stakes were no longer just about the plant. They were about her and the punishment that would follow. A few days later, in the mess hall, the external threat took on a new, sharper form. She had forced herself to go, to eat the watery potato soup, to be seen. The bread ration was served, as it sometimes was, wrapped in a sheet of discarded newspaper from the nearby town of Kearney. Most women threw the paper away, useless as it was, but Hannah, the teacher, was starved for words. She smoothed the cheap, rough paper on her knee, the ink staining her fingers. A headline, printed in thick, angry black letters, leaped out at her. "Local concern over Jap POWs. Are they being coddled?" Hannah's blood ran cold. She read the article, her limited English piecing together the vitriol. A local town councilman was quoted, indignant. His son was fighting in the Pacific. Why, he demanded, were these internees being given 3 meals a day? Why were they getting American food, American medicine? The article spoke of lazy, suspicious internees and soft camp command. It called for stricter controls, fewer privileges, harder work. It was a chilling, profound realization. The enemy was not just the barbed wire fence or the board guards. The enemy was outside. The town, the entire country, hated them. She looked up at Private Evans, who was standing by the door, idly tapping a stick against his boot. He wasn't just a bored young man. He was a member of that local community. His kindness, his ma'am, was not just fragile. It was an act of defiance against his own people. Or worse, it was a lie. She understood now. The guards weren't just following camp rules. They were under pressure from the angry, frightened world just beyond the fence. Evans's goodwill, if it ever existed, was meaningless. The camp command would bow to that pressure. The threat was no longer a single, curious guard. It was the weight of a nation at war. As if to confirm her fear, a notice was posted that evening. The camp was being assigned a new disciplinary officer, a Sergeant Miller, known for his adherence to the book. Inspections, it warned, would become more frequent and more thorough. Sergeant Miller was not a presence like Private Evans. He was an absence of warmth, of indifference, of humanity. He was a man made of straight lines and sharp noises. His boots struck the gravel with a punitive rhythm. His voice, when he barked orders, was like a dry file. The camp tensed. Work details were doubled. Rations were inspected. And, as promised, surprise inspections became the new, prevailing terror. Hannah, trapped in this rising tide of discipline, could do nothing but tend to her secret. The fear had forced her to stop the sunlight rituals, but the plant, with a defiant resilience that mirrored her own, continued to grow. It had survived the pale, starving days. The first 2 cotyledons, the seed leaves, were now joined by a new, miraculous development. In the pre-dawn dark, she pulled the tin out. A new leaf was unfurling from the center, but this was not like the others. It was not a simple, smooth oval. It was serrated, complex, and fuzzed with tiny silvery hairs. It was a true leaf. It was unmistakably, undeniably a daikon. She leaned closer, her breath held. She could smell it. Faintly, beneath the smell of damp earth and the tinny, metallic odor of the can, was a sharp, peppery, green smell. It was the smell of her mother's garden. It was the smell of home. A profound, quiet pride swelled in her chest, pushing back the fear. This was not a sprout. This was a plant. She had done this in a blue Spam tin, with scavenged mud and hoarded water, under the shadow of barbed wire and a hostile sky. She had created this. She had cultivated a piece of Shizuoka in the sterile heart of Nebraska. This was not contraband. This was not filth. It was an act of identity. She touched the leaf, her fingertip tracing its rough edge. It was strong. She felt her own resolve harden with it. She would protect this. It was no longer a question. Wait! The whistle. It was the wrong time. Too early for the midday meal. Hannah's blood froze. A voice, as sharp and cold as the whistle itself, barked just outside their door. Barrack C, inspection! Now, everyone out! Line up! It was Miller. Panic seized her. Women were scrambling from their cots, pulling on shoes. Mrs. Ito pushed past her. Hurry, Hana-san. He's not a patient man. Hana looked at the Spam tin, exposed on the floor. She had no time. No time to dig a hole, no time to hide it, no time to get back to her cot. The door flew open. Out! Now! Miller stood framed in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the gray light, a short shovel in his hand. Hannah did the only thing she could. She kicked the Spam tin with her heel, sliding it into the darkness under her cot just as she scrambled to her feet. The movement was small, but Miller's eyes, trained to catch any deviation, snapped to her. "Out! All of you! Line up!" he barked. The women stumbled into the aisle, their hands clasped, their faces blank. Hannah joined them, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She was last in line, her cot closest to the door. Private Evans was there, standing guard at the door, his rifle held across his chest. He looked pale, avoiding her gaze. Miller moved down the line, his eyes scanning each woman, then her cot, then the woman again. He was looking for something. A loose board, a hidden bundle, a flicker of guilt. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, boiled potatoes from the mess, and the sour scent of the unseasoned pine walls. He reached Hannah's cot. She stood rigid, her hands pressed so tightly together her knuckles were white. All her work, her hope, the small, green, living proof of her identity was 3 feet away from him, hidden by a few inches of shadow. He bent slightly. He saw the rags she had kicked in after the tin. "What's this?" His voice was low, suspicious. "Hoarding." He didn't use his hand. He used the short, sharp shovel he carried, its edge designed for breaking up frozen earth. He hooked the tip under the rags and yanked them out into the aisle. The object they revealed was stark, almost profane in the dim light. A bright blue, rectangular Spam tin. It was filled with dark, damp soil, and from its center, vibrant and impossibly green, grew the daikon plant, its true, serrated leaf unfurled like a banner. A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the women. Miller stared, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He poked the soil with a thick, gloved finger. "What is this? Contraband?" The mess hall whistle shrieked in the distance, signaling the midday meal. The very whistle she had used as a cover. The sound pierced her panic, sharpening it. Her fear was absolute, but it had changed. It was not for herself. It was not for the punishment, or the cell, or the loss of rations. It was for the life in that tin. It was the primal, protective rage of a mother. She could not move. Her voice was a dry whisper, tight with a terror that was greater than any she had felt for her own safety. "It is daikon." The words were an admission, a confession, a statement of fact. Miller looked from the plant to her face, his expression hardened. He saw this not as a plant, but as a breach of discipline. It was filth. It was defiance. He reached down, his gloved hand moving to grab the tin, to crush it, to destroy it. Miller's gloved hand descended. The thick black leather was an invading force, a shadow that would blot out the green. And Hannah moved. It was not a conscious decision. It was an instinct, a reflex of the soul. She took one step out of the line, breaking the rigid formation. The other women gasped. She did not grab his wrist. She did not strike him. As his fingers began to close around the blue tin, Hannah, the quiet, invisible teacher, placed her small, bare hand directly on top of his. The contact was shocking. Her skin on his glove. The warmth of her palm on the cold, treated leather. The barrack went utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Miller froze, his hand still on the tin, her hand now covering his. He looked up at her, his eyes wide, first with shock, then with a dark rising anger at her audacity. She met his gaze. She did not plead. She did not cry. Her voice was as quiet and strong as the plant's stem. "Please." She saw his jaw tighten, his body tensing to throw her off. She spoke again, the word coming from a place of absolute, unshakable conviction. "It is necessary." It was not a request. It was a statement, This was not a luxury, not contraband, not a whim. It was a necessary thing, like air, or water, or dignity. The word hung in the air, a profound and simple truth. Miller was speechless, caught between his authority and her impossible, quiet defiance. Private Evans, who had been watching, pale and frozen by the door, suddenly found his voice. It was sharp, loud, and broke the spell. "Sarge!" Miller's head snapped toward him. "Sarge, the radio just came." "In," Evans said, his voice tight with a false urgency. "Block C is reporting a water leak. Pipe burst in the washroom. It's flooding. Sounds bad." The tension shattered. The intimate, silent confrontation was broken by a loud, bureaucratic crisis. Miller stared at Evans, his mind clearly shifting from the insolence of the prisoner to the incompetence of the plumbing. A water leak was a logistical nightmare. It was paperwork. It was a real problem. He looked back at Hannah. His face was dark with annoyance. This plant was trivial, a speck of filth. The leak was work. He yanked his hand out from under hers. The force of it made her stumble back. "Get rid of that filth," he spat at her, the words a dismissal of her, the plant, and the entire confrontation. He pointed the shovel at Evans. "You're with me." He turned and strode out of the barrack, his boots striking the floorboards. Evans, his face averted, followed, pulling the door shut behind him. Hannah was left on her knees, her hand stinging from the shove. The women were silent, staring. She looked down. The blue Spam tin was still there. The daikon, its green leaf trembling slightly, was safe. After the inspection, the camp's rhythm changed. Sergeant Miller, having been cheated of his disciplinary action, focused his energy elsewhere. Private Evans, in their brief, silent crossings, never met her eyes. It was a shared, unspoken conspiracy. The plant, hidden in plain sight, was left alone. Spring melted into a hot, oppressive summer. The news came in fragments, first of a war ending in Europe, then, in August, of a final, terrible end in the Pacific. The whistles, the true rulers of the camp, grew softer. The barked orders were replaced by confused murmurs. The guards, including Miller, seemed to disappear, replaced by men in suits who carried clipboards. Hannah was given her release papers. She was a repatriate, a word that felt as foreign as internee. She was free to go. She packed her few belongings into the same small case she had arrived with, her koshihimo, the sewing kit, the wool blanket, and then there was the tin. She could not take the plant. It had grown strong, its leaves a vibrant deep green, pressing against the sides of its blue container. It was a living thing, rooted in Nebraska mud. To pull it out now would be to kill it. It did not belong on a train or in the city she was being sent to. This was the final conflict, a quiet, bittersweet choice. What would become of this symbol? What was the legacy of her survival if it was left to wither in an empty barrack? On her last evening, just as the sun was setting, she picked up the Spam tin. She walked out of the empty barrack, her steps sure. She passed the mess hall, silent now. She walked to the edge of the camp, near a fence post that marked the perimeter, where the prairie grass grew wild. She knelt. She did not use a shovel. She dug into the Nebraska soil with her bare hands. This earth was different from the mud she had scavenged from under the floor. This soil was rich, dark, and alive, smelling of rain and open sky. It was the soil of a continent, not a prison. With a tenderness that ached in her chest, she eased the daikon and its perfect, rectangular block of mud from the tin. She planted it in the hole she had dug, tamping the rich earth around its base. She looked at the plant, thriving and free in the open ground. Then she took the empty, bright blue Spam tin and pressed it firmly into the earth beside the plant. It was a marker, a monument, a strange hybrid headstone for a part of her that had died, and a cradle for the part that had been born. She was not just Hana Tanaka, the teacher from Shizuoka. She was the woman who had survived Nebraska, who had grown life in a can of refuse. She stood up, wiping the good soil from her hands. She looked at the two objects side by side, the green, Japanese plant and the blue, American tin, rooted together in the prairie. Hana picked up her suitcase. She walked toward the gate, toward the bus that was waiting. She did not look back.